Okay, I'm not going to beat around the bush. You are here because you want to learn how to paint miniatures, so I'm going to teach you all the steps to take you from this plastic sprue to this fully painted and based model. If this is your first ever time doing any kind of miniature painting, then you are in the right place. This is the ultimate guide to painting miniatures. I'm going to take you through from cutting it out of the sprue, to basing, to highlighting and shading and dry brushing and basing and all of that stuff until you have got a finished model at the end. I'm going to be chaptering this entire video, so if there is a specific step that you've already done and you want to skip forward, then please check the description or the timeline of the video itself to skip forward to the bit that is relevant to you. But let's get started straight away. The first thing we're going to be doing is cutting the model out of the sprue. So let's get started with the first step, cutting it out of the sprue. So most miniatures that you come across are going to be using one of these plastic sprues. I've got a little zoom in camera here that we can see all the details. So we've got it in separate parts. We've got a little crossbow here and a head and a shield. We're going to be making one of these castigators, which is from the Stormcast Eternal army in Warhammer Age of Sigmar. Games Workshop are the most prevalent miniatures makers out there, so most likely this is going to be the thing that you're painting with, which is why I've picked it. This is a very, very common model that you can get very, very easily, and these Stormcast Eternal models in general are usually available in sort of starter sets and things like that, so they come with a few bits. They should be nice and easy to get your hands on, but don't worry. This tutorial will cover any miniature that you want to paint as long as it's made out of hard plastic. I'm not going to be going into resin or metal because they're a little bit more complicated. They require a bit more sort of niche things that aren't going to apply to what we're doing today. For example, we're not going to be using super glue, we're going to be using plastic cement, we're not going to be pinning or washing the model beforehand or any of that kind of stuff. We're just going to use the bog standard plastic that most miniatures are made out of. So keep an eye out on what material your miniature is made from. If it is made from resin or metal or anything that isn't this sort of hard plastic, I think it's like polystyrene that's been like compacted or something like that, then keep an eye out for other tutorials around the internet of how to use those specifically. There's loads on YouTube. I'm not going to go into them right now, but if that is the model that you've got, either have a look at something hard plastic instead or have a look at those tutorials. But we're going to need to cut this thing out of the sprue. So we need a couple of tools to do this. First is a pair of clippers. They have this kind of pointed end at the top, sort of like a pair of scissors. You can see they work like scissors as well, which are going to cut them together. They kind of look like miniature wire cutters, but they can be used for cutting plastic. You're going to look out for ones that have this sort of flat bottom like this. And this is really important. We want to make sure that we pay attention to this. This is what we're going to use to actually cut from the model. And then the sort of tapered top is where the actual sprue end is going to go, and I'll show you that in a second. Another thing we are going to need is some plastic glue or plastic cement, depending on which brand you buy. They're all going to have different names. Both of these things you can buy from Games Workshop if you really want to. They're going to be more expensive than if you just get them in a hobby shop, so I wouldn't recommend it. But you're basically going to be looking out for something like this. This is plastic glue. It is different from normal glue because instead of making an adhesive between two objects, so if we use super glue, you're going to have like a hard sort of plasticky surface that is actually joining the two things that you're gluing together. With plastic cement, instead what it does is melt plastic and it bonds together itself. So it only works on this kind of hard plastic. Stuff like resin and metal, it's not going to be useful for, but it also means that it's going to have a much sort of firmer bond between the two objects, which means that it's a lot less likely to fall apart. Which if you're using super glue, it will work, obviously it is fine, but I tend to find that they're a little bit less rugged and they tend to fall apart a little bit easier. So those are the two things that we most want. You can also grab things like files, for example, which are going to be good for cutting away mold lines. I'm not sure if we've got any on this miniature itself, but basically where the sort of sprue ends, you'll have like the mold that they've injected the plastic into to make the models. You can almost see it on this sort of like castigator's little crossbow here. It is so tiny that the camera is not picking up on it, and that is why I would call this an optional step. I don't think it's very, very important to get away mold lines unless they're super, super visible. And on most of the small miniatures that you're going to be sort of like doing day to day, like the little unit sized ones, you're not going to notice them. Personally, I don't think. I would pretty much just ignore that unless you are working on something very big that has very obvious mold lines. At that point you might want to get a file, but they are literally just like a little nail file and they are just going to flatten that plastic. That is literally all they do. We're not going to bother with those today. They're very obvious and easy to use, so don't worry about that if you do need to grab one. So these are the two main things we want. We've got our glue and we've got our clippers, and we need to start cutting this out. This is where we're going to start looking at our instructions. So obviously this is a Games Workshop product, so they have pretty well laid out instructions. They're not the best in the entire world. We're going to be using one of these castigators here. I will say that some models do not come with instructions like this, especially if they're almost pre-cut out. I've had some like metal ones that do not come with instructions. You're just kind of expected to know how to put it together. It can be quite confusing at times, but usually there's somewhere online that you can find more details. That again is why it's useful to start with these Games Workshop products, because they come very, very much sort of all ready for you to go. If you've got like a sort of starter kit that comes with a model, you'll have pretty much everything you need in there. We're not sponsored by Warhammer or anything like that. They are just the biggest company that make miniatures, so they're going to have the most easy to use products. So like I said, we're going to use one of these castigators here, and we have our sprue. All of these are numbered. So we can see we've got sort of 24, 2, 16, 19. They're going to refer to the piece that they're next to. So we're going to just use our instructions here. I need to grab B1 for the back of this body, and I'll show you how to use these clippers. So holding our sprue in the offhand and our clippers in the main hand that we use, whether you're right or left-handed, we're going to find the point where the sprue meets the model. So you can see here, and this is where you need to be really careful because there are points. I'll use this head as an example. So we've got like a little sort of part of a model here. It's the head of one of these castigators, and you can see that there is an obvious point where it sort of joins up. It's a little bit more obvious to see on like this weapon, because obviously we all know what a crossbow looks like. Sometimes these models though will have little bits of joint which they use to glue to the rest of the model, so we don't want to cut here at the base of the head because we're actually going to be cutting away the thing that we need. So instead we have to cut right up against this part. So look for where it actually tapers off and where it actually meets the model, because be careful, you might cut off like the base of a staff or something like that, and then you're going to have to glue that back on, which is a pain in the ass, so make sure you don't do that. But we need B1, which is going to be this part of the body here. So these come in nice big chunks, which is nice and handy. Sometimes they'll come in quite small bits. The goal of this step is to get as little plastic sprue on the model as possible without doing any damage to the model itself. So this is nice and easy. So we've got a flat edge here right on where the cloak is. You can see, just like from me pushing my clippers around, we're starting to mark the plastic. Like, it's not actually that hard. It's quite soft and quite malleable when you use metal implements on it. So using the flat edge of these clippers, the bit where it actually has like a flat plane surface that you can run your finger over. See, if you flip it on the other edge, it's got like a divot. We don't want that to touch the model. We want that to be facing away from the model. We want the flat edge on the model itself. We're going to place that up against the joint, and we're just going to clip together. And that just forms a little cut between the model and the sprue. We do the same thing on this foot over here. Just make sure that you can see that. I'm going to have to contort myself to get it in on the camera here, but that's fine. So you can see that. We're just cutting here. Again. A little bit here. That bit actually has already got a separation between it. And then lastly, just up here on the shoulder, we're going to clip that again. And then that should come loose. If it's not coming loose straight away, you might have missed a bit, like I have here. So there's a bit here on the arm. And then here we go. So now that that is separated from the sprue, we have a piece of our model. So what you want to look out for now is go back to any of the bits where you have a part of the model which was attached to the sprue. So this foot, for example. You can see there's a tiny little bit of plastic here left over. You can just use the sharp edge of your clippers to just sort of like rub against it, just to flatten it down. You can also honestly do it with your nail. Like I said, this plastic is not super hard, it's still quite malleable. But then obviously if you've got that file that I was talking about earlier, if you've made a really dodgy cut and there's like a lump that you can't seem to get rid of, you can just use that file, just whittle it down, soften it out. The reason that's important is, first of all, obviously you don't want lumps sticking out of your model, because it's not going to look amazing. What is important is if you have any sprue cuts, if you have any points where the sprue has met the model and it's right on a joining line, right where the plastic is going to meet another bit of plastic for gluing together, it's important that you make that as flat as possible, because any bits of plastic that are sticking out from that mold line, from that join line, are going to separate the two pieces, and you'll end up with gaps in the model, which obviously are the most egregious thing, because they are going to stand out the most. So whilst it's important to cut off any extruding bits of plastic all over the model, it's very, very important that you get any of these points here where it is going to be joining with another piece of plastic, to make sure that you're not having anything get in between that mold line, that glue line. If it's very, very small, it might melt with the plastic glue, but any bigger than that, it's going to start leaving gaps in between your joints. So that is my B1. You can see that up next we need a B3 and a B2, which is going to be the head and a piece of arm. So I'm going to look for those. Okay, we have our pieces of plastic. Important tip, do not cut everything you need out for the model all at once, especially if they're on these numbered sprues. Some of these pieces look exactly the same to other pieces. It's going to be impossible to find them if they're not still numbered. So only cut things out that you are actively gluing in, because it makes it a lot easier to figure out where things are. So this is where you want to get your plastic glue out. So this plastic glue, as I said, is something that is going to literally melt your model. Try not to get it all over the surface parts of the model, otherwise it will look gloopy and weird, like it's been left out in the sun too long. These comes in all different shapes and sizes. A lot of them have these spouts at the top, which you can use for a little bit more finer detail. I tend to find, this happens to me a lot, whenever they have these kind of metal toppers, and I don't have one to show you right now, it tends to sort of get clogged up with plastic glue as it sort of dries. It's a pain in the arse. They come with lids. I use them. It doesn't seem to help. So sometimes you literally just have to take the metal thing out and just use the spout of the thing. It isn't the end of the world, but also these aren't the most expensive things in the world either. So, you know, glue dries up. It does become less usable with time. So try and keep them, you know, out of the sun. Try and keep them in a sort of dark, sort of cool environment so it's not drying up all the time. That will help. But it's not the end of the world if the metal thing doesn't work anymore. You can just use the top of the bob. So we're going to find our two bits that we're going to glue together. I'm going to start with B3, which is little arm, and I'm going to, before I put any glue on, I'm going to find where this joint matches up. So you can see that this is sort of the hand that's supporting the crossbow, and a lot of these newer Games Workshop models have these very specific joints to make it easier to get a precise mould line between the two parts. So in this case, I've got like a sort of square divot in the little bit of arm, and again, it's going to be difficult to pick up. I might have to do some zoom ins, but as we push that into the arm, you can see that it goes in, and I can literally hold it there without glue almost, as long as I haven't got it on its side. These models are push fit, and you can see they have these little circles in here where little divots of plastic are going to go in there, and essentially it will hold itself together without any glue. These are very handy if you don't have any glue on hand, and making things with glue is always a little bit more tricky, but they are not infallible. They can fall apart a lot easier if they don't have any glue in them. I tend to glue them anyway, even if they are push fit, and a lot of models are not push fit. The difference between push fit and non-push fit models is that push fit are essentially pre-posed. They can't really be put into any other sort of formation. So the pose that this model is in the book, with the crossbow sort of sticking out to the side, that is exactly how it's going to look when I'm finished building it. When you've got more ball jointed ones, which is sort of the classic miniatures, so they will literally just have like a large ball and then like a socket, you can place that arm however you want. So I can, imagine I am the model, I can literally have it sort of in any sort of rotation that I want it in. But that also means that it's going to be a little bit trickier to put together, because we're also going to have to account for the fact that, you know, if you've got two-handed weapons, it needs to match up. So if you've got one hand too high, then the gun won't go in and all that kind of stuff. So push fit are easier to put together, but they are a bit less freeing in the positions you can have your stuff in. This is a push fit model, as I said, nice and easy. So we're just going to find the joint and pop it in. Make sure that it's in the right way. Obviously, if I put it like that, it doesn't fit properly. But make sure that your arm is facing the right way. Check the thumbs on hands if you're doing any ball socket joints, because you don't want to end up with two right hands, two left hands. And we're just going to grab our glue, and we're going to put the tiniest amount right on where that joint is, where we're going to be doing the actual fitting together. Just to try and get as little to come out as possible. I'm going to grab the secondary piece of plastic, and we're just going to push them together. We can just use a tiny bit of kitchen towel to grab any glue that's excess, if any is spilt out. That's going to make it a little bit less messy on the joint itself. And any plastic glue that is sort of left over is going to warp the model a little bit on the inside. So try not to do a big splodge of glue, because that's just going to, like, as soon as you put those two pieces together, it will spill out everywhere, and if it goes on top of the surface of the model, like if it goes on top of the armor, for example, you can lose detail where it starts to melt things. So that is going to join together. Plastic glue is pretty fast working, so as long as you don't have a really heavy thing that you need to hold for a little while, you can just sort of let it sit there. And we're going to do the head whilst we're waiting. So again, we've got a little ball joint here, which is just going to make sure we have the head in the right place. So we're going to pop that in there, find the two sort of areas where these two models fit together nicely. And you can see that's glued in nice and easily. We're going to repeat all of these steps until we've got the model fully built, and I'll see you after that is the case. Okay, so we have our model fully put together. All that needs to be done is to put a black base on this thing. I've actually forgotten to bring one, so I'm going to use another one that I've already constructed that has a black base on it. You can see that the hexagonal feet of these Stormcast just sort of go into hexagonal points in the base itself. So even just putting it on the black bases has been made super easy with these kind of models. If you don't have anything like that, any sort of like points that sort of stick into the ground of the model, you can see that there's quite a few different sort of variations in these Warhammer bases, and they come in different shapes and sizes to different sized models and different locations for the feet. If you don't have anything like that to join the model to the base itself, a lot of the time they'll just have a flat surface, whether it's the base of the feet or the bottom of a tail or whatever it is, that will stick to that base itself. So you just like you were putting together two pieces of a model, you just want to find those flat planes and just glue it down onto the black base. But once you've got that on the base, it's not coming off, so make sure that you're happy that it's nice and easy to paint, got all different angles. There are ways of constructing models to make it easier to get into certain hard to reach places. For example, some of the models in this set come with shields. Shields are something that can quite easily block off the vision. So I think I've got a shielded model here, for example. If we look at this model here that has its own shield, that is going to make it quite difficult to get in behind that shield and sort of paint this little hand here and all that sort of thing. Oftentimes these shields will come detached from the hand itself. If you want, you can paint that shield separately and then only glue it together once you've painted everything. I'm usually too lazy to do that. I will just paint everything and then just suffer through the fact. But you can be a better person than me. So the next step is to base spray this model. So as these plastic miniatures come, they come on this sort of like grey plastic. As I said, they can come in metal and resin as well, which can have slightly different surfaces. Resin and metal especially need to be primed before you can paint on them, because the paint will literally just fall off because they have such slick surfaces. These plastic miniatures you can technically paint straight on, but it's just not gonna work well. Oftentimes even these hard plastic miniatures have like quite a slippy surface to them, which makes them quite difficult for paint to adhere to. And that is why we tend to do a base spray. Even if we spray it grey, because that's the colour we want to base it with, we'll still spray onto it so that we're doing paint on paint rather than paint on plastic. Because when you're spraying it out of a rattle can, it's a lot easier to adhere that paint to the surface of this miniature, because it is literally just being applied rather than painted on with a brush stroke, which is going to make it a little bit more difficult to get like a flat, even surface. So we've got a few different options for basing. We can do it by hand, as I said, with a brush. It's not always the best technique, but if that's all you've got with you, then, you know, like, it's still going to come out okay. You're still going to be painting over that colour, so don't worry too much about how choppy the finish is, as long as your paint is going over smoothly with the second coat that you apply. The most common way of doing things is to grab one of these rattle cans. So again, this is Games Workshop branded one. These things are pretty expensive. I do not recommend buying these at all. As you can see, we are not sponsored by Games Workshop. These are super expensive, and honestly, the paint that is in here is the exact same as the stuff that you would get from a pound shop that sells like car spray paint. As long as you're getting acrylic spray paint, if it's good enough for someone's car, it's good enough for your little plastic miniatures, I promise you. These sprays can set you back like a tenner from Games Workshop. You can get other ones that are about £5 or so on Amazon, but honestly, you can get just some car, make sure it's a matte finish, but if you get some car spray paint, it is exactly the same stuff. It will come out exactly the same. I've been using them since I started miniature painting. There is no difference whatsoever, as long as you use a matte finish. Don't get anything gloss, because that will be a nightmare to paint over and will not look good. But if you do have at home one of these Games Workshop cans, obviously that they are custom built for miniatures, so they're still going to work. They're just a little bit more expensive. One thing that is very important when using these rattle cans is to shake it when you get it. Shake it as long as you can be bothered to shake it, because the unshaken cans will get a little bit clumpy and they will come out a little bit less smooth than you want them to. There is a guy on YouTube that I used to watch tutorials from who would say shake it till you're bored, and that is exactly what you should do. Now, next up is the colour selection. So obviously I've got some white here. White is a pretty good colour to base with if you're looking for something sort of high contrast, really, really vibrant. If you're looking for really colourful, like bright yellows and oranges and reds and all that kind of stuff, white is a good base spray for that because all paint is semi-translucent, so the paint underneath is going to affect the tone of the paint on top. If you want to spray something which is going to be really dark, so for example, if you're painting like, Chaos or Skaven or anything like that, anything that's got like really desaturated, dark, kind of gloomy colours, that's when you might want to spray with a grey or a black, because again, when you put those colours over black, it's slightly translucent, so it's always going to come out a little bit darker than it would on a white. Your other option, and this is something that I do quite a lot, is you can actually get these coloured sprays. So again, these are Games Workshop products, but you can just sort of get a spray which matches the colour of the model that you're trying to paint. So for example, if you were painting sort of red Space Marines, blue Space Marines, you can grab those red and blue paints, because that is going to be the main colour that you're working with. It stops you having to physically apply that coat to every single miniature that you're painting, especially if you're doing a massive army and they've all got to be painted pretty much 90% blue. Grab a blue spray paint, because there's no point in you applying that colour every single one. You can just start with it already applied, good to go. For example, we've got a Rune Lord Brass here, which is kind of a metallic spray paint, which I might use on my miniature, because that's going to give me that sort of metal armour already finished. So you can see that on these models, all this silver that you can see on the armour, I've just used a silver spray paint, and that is just made sure that I've got something ready to roll at the start of the miniature painting process. So I think I'm going to use this Rune Lord Brass to spray my miniature, and that means that I'm going to have a nice metallic finish to start with, which is going to cover all of the actual armour itself. Then I can just focus on painting the gold and the fabrics and washing and all that kind of stuff. It's going to come out a lot quicker. Your final option, which is something that is going to be a little bit more of an advanced technique and will depend on how you are sort of painting your miniatures after the spraying process, is what's called a Zenithal highlight. You don't have to do it Zenithal. Zenithal essentially means it's following the sun at its zenith. So obviously we're painting a 3D object, so we want to make sure that if we're trying to get like a realistic finish on the model, that we want the top parts of anything that's going to catch the sun to be really bright, and then we want anything that's going to fall into shadow underneath to be really dark. So an easy way of doing that is to spray a miniature either black or grey, and then spray it white just from the angle at which you want light to be hitting the model. So Zenithal highlight would be right from the top. You just spray top down, and that's going to have white right on top, black right on bottom, so you've got like a nice natural shadow cast, and that gives you a sort of base of where you want light to be hitting on your model when you're actually applying those colours. And if you just do like a flat colour all the way over, as I said, paint is semi-translucent, which means that all of those white parts of the model are going to be really bright and like they're going to be in the sun, and vice versa, the shadowy, darker parts are going to get hit by that black paint, and they're going to be darkened down and dimmed down as well. So it's a good way of adding some contrast and some highlights and some shadows to your model right from the get-go before you've even done any kind of painting whatsoever. Just to give you an idea of how the spraying process works, you're going to be holding your miniature either on some kind of applicator, so you might have like a flat piece of wood that you sort of glue your models to so that you can get all of them in a nice big row. You might place them down in like a little cardboard casing so that you can spray around the miniature without touching anything on the back, because remember, when you are spraying with these cans, you're spraying everything you're pointing at, even the stuff behind the miniature. So if you do it on, please don't do this inside, like these are aerosols, so they're not going to be great for you. But even if you're doing it out in the garden, like make sure you're not spraying right above your like flagstones or grass or anything like that, because they are also going to get sprayed red, blue, white, gold, whatever it is. I tend to use a process in which I will just glove this hand, grab the miniature from the base, and then I can just turn the miniature around to make sure I'm getting a nice even coat. And one thing you want to be doing when you are spraying these models, which is really important, is to not just spray directly onto the model flat like this and then just leave it. As you spray these minis, they are going to collect more paint, and that paint is going to get thicker and thicker. And the thicker the paint on your model, the less detail is going to show through from all of those lovely little divots from, you can see on this scroll, for example, it's got all sorts of markings on there, which are just going to get completely lost in the spray if you don't pay attention to how much paint is getting applied. So what I do is, and obviously this is going to be, it's going to use a lot more paint to do it because a lot of the paint is not going to go on the miniature, but I will just spray back and forth like this, which just means that as I'm going around this model, I'm just making sure that I'm not hitting any one surface for more than about a half a second. And then just by doing this kind of back and forth motion, you get like a flat, even, nice and clean coating on the model to make sure that nothing is really thick. So I'm going to go do that now. I might take a camera out with me just to show you what I'm doing, but we'll see about that in the edit. But if not, I'll come back and I'll have a nicely base coated miniature ready to paint. Okay, so we have a base coated model. So as you can see, I've done that Rune Lord brass. It's come out nice and metallic, and I've got a nice even coat all the way around. So there's no parts of the model that are still grey, because anywhere that's still grey is still plastic, so that's still going to be difficult to paint over. Also, during the break, my hay fever has got really bad, so I apologise for all the sniffing that is probably going to come up. You might have heard it in the previous bit, but it is really bad now, so sorry in advance. That means we are ready to start painting this, guys. So what we're going to do first is assemble our tools. So first thing we're going to need is a brush, and obviously brushes come in all shapes and sizes. You can see some of the ones that I've got in my set here, as well as some soap. So these brushes, I have a couple that are from the Games Workshop line, although in general I do not buy brushes from Games Workshop. They're again very expensive, not that amazing. The one that I do use quite a lot is their XL base brush, because it is really big, so if you're doing a massive model, it's great for just applying paint really quickly. But apart from that, I tend to just grab, just synthetic ones. You can get them for literally about £5 on Amazon for a whole set, all different sizes. These green Humbrol ones, Humbrol Coloro, I believe they're called. Again, it literally costs like under £10 for a whole set, and they work absolutely fine. Like there is no problem with them whatsoever. They're not going to last quite as long maybe as some of the more expensive brushes, but in general, miniature painting, I tend to find that you're doing so much painting against like hard 3D objects with edges and stuff, the brushes will fray quite easily. And if you're very good at looking after your brushes, you can keep them for a very long time. But if you're not, like me, then obviously you don't want something that's going to be extremely expensive to replace. So the cheaper the brush that you buy, the cheaper it is going to be to replace it if you ever need to. So like I said, I'm just buying cheap brushes. You do not need to buy official ones. This new set here I got from Hobbycraft, I think, and literally just like a £5. And I've got a nice set of acrylic synthetic brushes. So I'm just going to grab a generic size. I'm just going to go with this one here. This is a sort of, if I just hold it up to my finger here, you can see the sort of size that I'm going with. In general, you don't want to go too small with your brushes. Any sort of brush that is way too small, if you get used to using that, you're not going to get the sort of technique that you need to be able to do fine details very easily. The smaller the brush, the more you're kind of compensating for the fact that you've got like a shaky hand, rather than actually, training your hand to not shake anymore, if that makes sense. So I tend to just find a normal size brush. You don't want one that's going to be much bigger than your model, obviously, because we're going to be applying coats onto this kind of surface area. So any bigger than this would probably be a little bit silly. But once we've got our brush, we are going to need somewhere to put our paint in between the brush and the pot. There's all sorts of paints which I'll talk about in a second, but where you put them is also important. So what I have here is a wet palette. This is one that is officially made by Army Painter. This is like in a plastic case, and it's got like little brush holders and all that kind of stuff. It's very fancy. Essentially all it is a little piece of foam, which is just like a thin layer of what they call hydrofoam, which is essentially just a piece of foam that absorbs water like a sponge and then just stays wet. And then on top of that, you've got what is essentially greaseproof paper, which you just line on top right like this. Get it wet on the edges so it doesn't fold over. And then this is essentially just gonna sit on top of that wet sort of foam underneath, and then you're going to put your paint on top of this paper. The reason that you're going to do this is because acrylic paints are water-based. So any paint that you buy for your miniature painting is going to be based with water, which means that they dry by having that water evaporate. So acrylic paints dry really quickly, and as you've got them on your palette, because obviously you just wait for water to evaporate, they go real quick, which means that as you're painting with them, if you get a big glob on your palette, then it's going to be dried by the time you've even finished doing like 1 or 2 coats, which is awful because you go through paint so quickly. Wet palettes are great because they hydrate your paint, and they keep it hydrated for a long time. In fact, these ones are so good that I can literally put paint on this, leave it overnight, and it's still fine in the morning. So if you're doing a lot of painting, then these wet palettes are a great thing to grab. If you don't have one of these, you're just starting out, you can literally just grab like a piece of cardboard, whatever, somewhere to put your paint, so that you're not dunking it right into the pot and then going straight onto the model with that. And we'll get into why in a second. But the main thing is make sure you've got somewhere that you put your paint in between putting it on the brush and getting it out of the pot itself. If you want to make one of these wet palettes on your own as well, you don't have to buy a fancy one. You can literally just get like a takeaway box, essentially. Fill that up with sort of kitchen roll that is sodden, so just completely full of wet. And then put some grease-proof paper that you would buy for your kitchen on top of that. Make sure it's nice and flat, so there's no air between the wet paper and the grease-proof paper, and then you've essentially made your own wet palette. You can literally just put a lid on it as well if you've got it in a takeaway box. So I bought a nice one just because, you know, it's nice to have nice things when you do something quite often. In the end, if you really like miniature painting, I would say invest in the hobby. Like, make it easier for you to do the thing that you enjoy doing, because you'll just enjoy it more as you do it. So this is my sort of nice little treat for myself, but you don't have to get a really expensive one. Even this, I think, was like maybe like 20 quid or something like that. So they're not ridiculously expensive, even if you do want to upgrade. Okay, let's start talking about paints. So obviously paints, there are a wide range of different brands, and even in those brands, the sort of subcategories that they have. Most people use Citadel paints because, again, Warhammer, it's the one that everyone knows. So Citadel paints come in these little sort of pots like this. They just open up top, open like this. You can see this one is already starting to dry out. These pots are not fantastic because they lose a lot of their moisture quite easily. I tend to prefer brands that use these sort of dropper bottles, like Vallejo or Army Painter, for example, use these as well, so that I can just sort of drop these onto my palette. And this is an actual screw-on lid, so I tend to find that these last a lot longer. Whereas those Citadel ones, if you do not close them properly, they will literally be just a dry pot of, you know, just opaque solid mass, which is obviously not great for painting with. There's all sorts of brands that you can pick from. So there's Citadel, there is Vallejo, there's Army Painter, there's all sorts of like indie brands that do their own stuff. Like if you look up acrylic paint, there is an absurd amount. I would usually tend to look at the ones that are actually built to be going on plastic, because obviously you don't want anything that's going to dry strange and like mess up your model, because obviously then, you know, what's the point in it? So in general, probably look for something that is custom made for miniature painting. There's obviously miniature paints that you get for stuff like model airplanes and things like that. That is the same paint. I tend to find that they're really thin and quite oily though. So they dry a lot different than what you would expect from the paints that I normally use day to day, if that makes sense. They are made for like big flat planes like cars and airplane wings and all that kind of stuff, so they might just be a little bit different formulation from what I'm used to, but if that is what you've got, that will work. It's just going to be getting used to whatever it is that you've got. And when it comes to choosing the actual paints that you're going to use, that's where things get a little bit more confusing, because there are a few different types of paint regardless of what brand you go with. And they're all going to have different uses on the model. So the most common paint that you'll grab is just a base paint. So this is just acrylic paint in a colour. This one is called Orc Blood, and it is by Army Painter. This is going to come out nice and thick. We can then thin it down with water, and we'll apply it straight onto our model after the base coat. And that is going to be where we actually do our sort of colouring in, essentially. That is where we're going to be applying the colour that we want our model to look like onto the model. That's the most basic paint. Everyone will sell those, and that is the thing that you're going to start off with, which we'll be getting to in a second. After you have done that, that's when you start looking at washes. Citadel call these shades. This is a Nuln Oil, so this is a black wash. This, as you can see, as I sort of flick it around in my hand, this is a very thin paint. This has been thinned right down, and the purpose of this is to get into all the little nooks and crannies of your model. Naturally, because it's thinner, it just sort of pulls into all of the recesses of the model, and that is going to pick out all of your shadow details for you. So a lot of miniature painting is just kind of these little hacks that you use to try and make things go the way that you want them to. So shading is great for putting shadows into your model to make sure that they look nice and deep and detailed and 3D. That is exactly what those shade paints are for. Conversely, you can then get paints called drybrushing paints, and obviously you can kind of do this with any paint. Drybrushing is a technique in which, instead of the paint being incredibly wet, it's incredibly dry instead. You flick your really hard bristled brush against the edges of your model, and that's going to pick up all of those raised details instead, and that's really good for highlighting. After that, you've got all sorts of technical paints for things like rust or blood or anything like that. Recently, a lot of people have been making these kind of speed paints, or I think Games Workshop were the first ones to do it. They call them contrast, so they've got a new line coming out as well. These ones are really interesting. They go on like a wash, but they're really pigmented, like a base coat is. So by painting them over a bright white that you've sprayed on your miniature, it will essentially create like a really contrasted version of that color. So this is Plasmatic Bolt by the Speed Paint line. So you can almost see that they've used this 3D cube to show like this is what the highest parts of the model will look like, then the middle, and then the shadows. So it's almost like doing a wash and a highlight and a paint all in one go. These are great for getting models up really fast, but also they're a little bit unforgiving, because obviously if you go over somewhere, then it's not white anymore, so it's difficult to clean up your mistakes. But for now, if you're assembling your paints, we're just going to start with base paints. So grab some acrylic paint, no matter what brand it is, in the colors that you want. We're going to be painting whatever miniature it is that you've built and primed. I'm going to be painting this Stormcast here. I'm going to go for like an orange. I do a lot of orange because I like warm tones. But just pick whatever you like. Don't worry about color theory or, like warm tones and cool tones and all that kind of stuff. If you're just starting out, pick a color scheme that you like. Imagine that you're making your little army. What is the colors that they are flying on their banners? Start there. And as you get better at painting, you will get better at knowing how contrast works and how better to have sort of like light sources in your model paints and all that kind of stuff, how to build up color through highlights and shadows and all that kind of thing. But at the start, we're just going to be doing a very basic coat of paint. So you just want the colors that you need for that model. Last thing I'll point out as well, I've already done a metallic base for this model, because obviously it's got a metallic spray paint over it. Metallics are just sort of shiny, kind of almost like glittery paint that looks like faux metal. Hence the word metallic, which means that they're going to be great for things like armor or tanks or anything like that. They come in bottles just like this. Army painting one here. This one's called Plate Mail Metal. This is a kind of similar colour to what I've got here. They're shiny, essentially. They're very thick paints, so they will go on a little bit more gloopy than you're used to from the other colours, but that's just another type of paint that you can use. I'm going to be using them a little bit for some detailing, but apart from that, I've mainly done all the metallics, so just point out that might not come up quite as much. So let me assemble the colours that I want to use, and we'll go from there. Okay, so first I'm going to do the orange. When you're first painting your model, just pick a nice big flat plane that you think is going to be really easy to paint. This little sort of skirt that these warriors have, this sort of like cloak that's hanging down from their waist, this is a big flat open plane where it's all going to be one colour, so it's a nice easy starting place for me to just get used to how that paint's going to apply on this model. So once I've picked my colour, I've got this lava orange from Army Painter. I'm going to shake it up, and we are going to pop some on our palette. We don't need a huge amount because we're just painting one miniature, so don't go overboard. I'm just going to grab my wet palette here. I'm just going to make a little dot, and that is ready to go. Now you notice that I shook my paint before I put it in. That's because these paints can separate if you leave them for a little while, so make sure you give them a good shake to make sure they're in the perfect pristine condition before they come out of the bottle. Now obviously orange isn't the only paint colour that we're going to be using, which means we need some water so that we can clean our brush as well. This is just a mug of plain tap water. If it's warm, it helps to wash the brush, but don't have like boiling water or anything like that because you might damage the bristles on your brush. And you can literally just wiggle your brush around in the water just to sort of loosen those bristles up. If you just bought a new brush, it might be a little bit solid from inside the packet. Make sure that when you're washing your brush though, do not like ram the bristles into the bottom of the mug or anything like that. The way that brushes work is they are held together by this piece of metal here. I can't remember all of the key terms or anything like that, or specific terminology for brush stuff, but essentially this metal clasp around your bristles is keeping it together. I think it's called a firmament or something like that. Right here at the head of the metal where the bristles are actually poking out is what gives your brush its shape. So if you are smushing the bristles down, it's going to fan out and it's going to bend right here at the bottom, and it's going to ruin all that lovely pointed shape that you've got of your brush. And making sure that these brushes last a long time, a lot of it is just making sure that you take care of them in between each brush stroke and each wash and all that kind of stuff, because dipping your paint too much or washing it a little bit too aggressively is going to make those bristles just fan out, and then it's going to be a nightmare to paint with. You're going to have to buy some more. So don't do that, basically. So we're just going to grab our mug, give it a little swirl around, make sure it's nice and wet, And then the last thing, we also need some kitchen roll. So kitchen roll, any kind of tissue paper really. It's just going to give us something that we can dry our brush on. So I can just gently pat this. I don't actually like smush or like rub or anything like that. I just sort of gently, as if I was painting with the brush, just sort of press those bristles against the kitchen roll or paper towels or whatever it is you call them. And that is just going to get some of the water off. You can also just give it a little lick, because saliva is a good way of keeping your bristles together as well. It's probably not an official technique, but it's a thing that most painters do. Most paint is non-toxic, but do check the label just in case. Right, so we've got all the stuff we need here, so I'm good to start painting, and I'm going to grab our orange paint. So you can see that, like I said, these paints do separate a little bit, so there's a little bit of marbling going on here, so I'm just going to mix that around a little bit. Making sure, as I said, to not get any paint anywhere near the base of this brush. You only want it on the tip. And that is just going to mix together and get us this lovely orange. And as I pull that paint onto my brush, I don't want too much. I'm just going to pull back, sort of spin my brush as I do it to preserve the tip. And then I've just got a little bit of paint here. Now this paint might go on a little bit too thick, and to stop that, we can just grab our mug of water and just do just the tiniest little dab. I'm not sure you can see into the water here. I'm just going to do the tiniest little dab just so that the paint just sort of blooms out from the bristles itself, and then just mix that back into the paint here to thin it down a bit. As I said, these paints are water-based, which means that, you know, the thinner the paint, the more water it has in it. So if you need your paint to be thinner than it is, all you need to do is add a tiny bit of water. Don't add too much, sort of thin too much, obviously, and then it'll just be like a wash. But if it's going on too thick, and you'll know it's going on too thick because you'll start to see these big globs of paint on your model, and that's not what we want. In general, we want to make some nice, thin coats of colour over our model. You can see that this is not actually covering up the underside colour too much. But this is actually going on pretty thin. The reason we're doing this is it's a lot easier to put more paint on than it is to take paint off. Taking paint off means basically starting from scratch. Adding more paint is just a little bit more time spent on the model. So I'm just going to do a nice thin coat over all the areas where I want this paint to sit. Then that is not only going to start building up our colour, but it's also going to start getting a nice matte surface for the rest of our paint to sit on. Because as we add more paint, it's going to be easier and easier to get more paint on top. Because putting paint on paint is easy, putting paint on plastic is difficult. So the more paint that we have between us and the coat that we're applying right now, the easier it is to get a nice bold colour. And like I said, if we're using paints, especially with these bright, vibrant tones like oranges and yellows, they are going to come out quite thin, and you're going to look at that and think, that's not the colour I want, that doesn't look anything like the orange that I want. Don't panic, let it dry. These acrylic paints dry so quickly. You can just go over, just wash your brush nice and regularly to make sure that it's not clumping up with paint and becoming all thick and the bristles getting all dirty and horrible. So otherwise, again, that brush is not going to be very nice to use. We're just going to towel off our brush, grab another little bit of paint on the bristles, and maybe we can go a little bit thicker this time now that we're getting a bit more used to it. We can start applying again. Look for the bits where it started to dry. We can apply again there. And you can see, as we start to apply this second coat, this is going to come out a lot more vibrant. Now I'm not pushing hard on this model, I'm just gently letting the paint glide over it. So we don't really want brush strokes coming up after doing some kind of special technique. We're just trying to get a flat colour. We just want that colour to come nice and flatly onto the model. We don't want to be manipulating the paint too much, otherwise those brush strokes are going to be left on the model, which isn't really what we're after. So like I said, as we start to build these coats up, just going to get thicker and thicker. I purposefully picked a paint colour. It's quite difficult to apply to show you just how long sometimes it can take to get a nice flat tone. Again, I'm just going to keep my brush nice and wet, nice and washed off. Grabbing a bit more paint, just twirling the bristles in that paint to get a nice tip. I'm going to find another bit to apply to whilst that's drying. So we've got a little bit more skirt on the front here. And there's actually, and you can see on this finished version, so we've got the same model here that's painted. You can see the purple and the cream. You can see the purple and the cream on this one. We've actually got like a sort of two-tone pattern on the sort of loincloth almost thing that's hanging down. We've got the cream, and then the skirt underneath is the purple. So we can get a little bit more contrast in the model. So if we're going to follow that same pattern, I'm going to be avoiding this little middle area, just painting on the outside. And don't worry, we can paint back over anything that we paint to a different colour that we needed. So I'm just going to, again, just put a nice flat tone of orange. Trying to avoid pressing too hard or anything like that. Just applying that orange across all of this little skirt. Making sure we've got a nice even coverage. Again, it's going to look nice and thin. And we're going to think, oh god, that's nowhere near orange enough. What am I doing wrong? Don't panic. It's literally just because the paint is nice and translucent. So it's not going to go into big bold oranges in the first attempt. So you can see now the difference. This is after one coat. You can barely see the orange. We flip that round to where our 2 coat is. That orange is a lot more prevalent. So we can grab another load of paint on our brush, start going back over this one. You can see now as this 3rd coat comes in, it's just starting to fill those cracks. Becoming a lot more bold, a lot more vibrant. And you'll find that if you've done a quite a dark undercoat, so this metallic is not the darkest thing in the world, but it's not bright white. So we've got to have a bit of patience to get that pigment over the top of this undercolor here. Because otherwise we are just colouring the metal rather than applying our own colour. And as we get to this 3rd coat here, suddenly that's looking a lot more orange. I'll give that a little twirl around. You can see the difference now between that and the metal. That is a much more bold tone. As we flip that back around again, look at it after 1 coat. There's a world of difference between those coats. And that shows you how important it is to just be patient, not put huge globs of paint on your bristles to try and make up for the fact that the paint's translucent. Just do nice, even, flat, thin coats, and that's going to get you to the colour that you want a lot quicker. So again, I'm going to wash my brush. Being able to go back and forth from 2 different places with the same colour is a great way of making sure that the coat of paint that you worked on previously is already dry before adding a coat on top. So this should be nice and dry now. As I said, it dries nice and quick. So again, I can just apply a little bit more on top. And this is a thin orange. These highly pigmented colours, you know, they're not quite as opaque. You know, if I was painting black over the top of something, it would not take many coats for that to cover the undercoat that I'm painting on top of. It's such a bold, thick and opaque colour. Whereas something like orange, nice and bright, nice and vibrant. It'd be even worse if I was doing yellow, for example. It takes a few coats to get it where we want to. Right, I'm going to carry on building up this orange and just do all of those bits of cloak here. Feel free to do the same if you're following along at home. And I'll join you for the next colour. Okay, so that's my orange all finished, and you can see as I turn it round, looking a lot more vibrant than when I first put that coat of paint on at the start. Now this is after about, you know, maybe 3 or 4 different coats, because it's such a bright colour, so translucent that I need to make sure I build it up nice and slowly to make sure it looks as good as it can. But I think you'll agree that is looking like a lovely orange. So next up, I need to pick the next colour I'm going to be working with. So luckily for me, a lot of this model is metal, and because I've used a metal base spray paint, I don't actually have that much more to paint, which is great. If you're working on something that either you've just sprayed white or whatever, you might be going through quite a few different colours. For me, I'm just going to be working on a few different detail bits, but it's a great way of getting to a quick finished paint job so I can show you what we do in the next few steps. So next up, we've got this loincloth here that I'm going to paint in a contrasting colour. And I need something that's going to work well with orange. This is when you want to start thinking about how colours work together. So I've already got this orange here, this lava orange from Army Painter that I've used as my sort of my main colour. This is the one that's going to be appearing on most of the model if we're not counting the armour. So I need something that's going to complement it well. Now, I'm not a colour theorist. I do not know the perfect way of, making sure that certain colours contrast and pop well with each other. But I do know a very easy way to make sure that you're getting a nice bit of contrast. Orange is a very warm colour. It is on the warm end of the spectrum. If you think about light, especially white light, we tend to go from orange to blue. Somewhere in the middle is that perfect white. So if I've got a lot of orange, then I need something that's a little bit cooler, a bit more of a cool tone. So I'm going to look for something a bit dark as well, because this is quite a bright colour. So I want something that's a little bit darker, which is going to make it look a little bit more impressive against it. Now this dark stone, for example, is nice and dark, but it's actually quite a warm tone. It's almost more like a brown than it is a grey, so I think that's actually going to wash out my orange, so I'm going to find something a little bit different. Now this Necromancer cloak, again, it's a bit more grey than it is brown, so it's a little bit on the cooler end of the spectrum. And I think this is going to be a nice contrast. I don't want to do straight black because I think we're going to lose a bit of detail, so by using a grey I can almost darken down and then get closer to that black, but without losing all of the depth of the model. So I'm going to get some of this grey and I'm going to pop it on my palette. And you can see that I barely put any orange down, and look, I've used all the amount that I needed to use, which is great. It means I'm not wasting paint if I don't actually need it. So we put a blob of grey down there, again just a nice small bead of it, making sure our brush is nice and clean so that it's not getting any of the old paint into the new paint. So we're not trying to mix these are just flat base colours. And again, we've got a bit of marbling going on just where the paint's separated in the pot, so I can just mix that together. Now I've got way too much paint on my bristles here, so I'm just gonna twist that paint back into the palette, rotating my brush so that I've got a nice point at the end. This is going to be quite an opaque paint, quite dark, quite thick, so it shouldn't need as many coats as the orange. So now that we've done our big first coat, obviously we're going to make a little bit more trouble for ourselves by painting around those bits where we've already painted. If you do accidentally paint over the edge of where you're trying to paint, don't worry, you can just come back again with the original colour to clean it up. As you get used to painting, you'll do this quite a lot. It is not the end of the world, it just means it takes a little bit longer, and that's fine, because we're doing it because we enjoy it, not because we need to get it done. So, I'm going to grab this grey and I'm going to paint this sort of loincloth in the centre. Just grabbing a grip on the model that helps me get the angle that I need. You don't have to be holding it upright all the time. So I'm going to pop this upside down so that I've got those flat edges a little bit easier to access. Just make sure that we're framed up and get our first coat on. Okay, so we've got our sort of central area here nice and grey, just giving a little bit of contrast to that orange, making it stand out a little bit more. Flip it around, I've got this sort of belt, sort of sash area, which I'm going to do in the same colour. I'm going to keep, as I did before, just going between these two, building up those layers till we get a nice, strong, and opaque colour. Now, as I get to these finer details, you notice I'm going to be rotating this model around in my hand quite a lot. It's going to make it a little bit trickier to film, but the point is, you want to find the angle at which it's easiest to get your brush comfortably on the plane that you're trying to paint. So don't just keep it in a set position and try and paint around like this. Move the model, not your hand. Your hand should just be in whatever comfortable position you find it in, and then your model will just come and sort of rotate around to find the most comfortable grip for you to paint with. Another reason you don't want to absolutely load your paintbrush with too much paint is because the more paint you put on a model per coat, the longer it takes to dry. It means you've got whole areas where you're waiting ages for that paint to dry, and if you get impatient, try to paint over it. In this sort of semi-dried state, I'm not sure if you'll be able to pick it up that well on the camera here, but as I try and move that around, instead of actually just applying the new paint, I'm sort of moving around the old paint because it's still wet, and that will then become more translucent and look crap, it'll look streaky, it won't look good. And then lastly, you'll see there's this sort of underside to the cloak, just right by the feet. I'm going to paint that with my secondary cloth colour as well. And then that is just going to make it look a little bit more neat, look like a bit more intentional of an edge. That sort of implies, even though you can't see it, but that grey colour is kind of the inside fabric of what they're wearing. And that's right at the bottom of the Mini, so I don't need to bother too much about how clean that coat is, as long as it's not affecting the orange up top. Now you notice I can use this as a comparison because I've got the same model sort of painted into two different colour schemes. Right at the top here, where they've got this sort of bit of cloth hanging over like the breastplate of the armour, you can see that on this model I've used my secondary colour to paint that, whereas on this model I've used my primary colour. And honestly, it's completely up to you. As you can tell, they both look good. It's completely about how you want to paint each part of your model. If you want this armour to be bright pink, then go make it bright pink. There is ways in which you can make that colour look like cool armour, you know? So pay more attention to what you want the model to look like than what you think will look the best. And once you start to get really advanced, you can then start making those two things conjoin, where you're not sort of sacrificing the way in which you want the model to look like, but you're also following those, you know, guiding principles and making sure that it looks as best as it can. Okay, so that kind of covers all of the cloth materials. We've got a little bit of paper hanging from the belt here. We've got the belt itself. So the belt I want to have like a leathery look, so I'm going to go brown, and then with that paper I'm going to show you a little trick. So let's start with the brown leather, and I think I've got a literal leather brown paint somewhere here. There we go, leather brown. It's a nice and light one, so it's going to contrast against that dark grey that we've got for our secondary colour. Now this is where it's going to get tricky, and this is the thing about painting miniatures. Sometimes you'll have objects in the way of the thing that you're going to paint, which will make it a little bit difficult to get to the areas that you're trying to reach. But don't be disheartened. If, again, you paint over the work that you've already done, you can just go back with the same colour and clean it up. So trying to avoid the handle of the hammer, I'm just going to paint these little leather straps. Again, just rotating that model at all times to make sure I've got the best angle I can find. Okay, we've got a bit of brown leather there. I'm now going to grab a sort of pale white colour. We're going to go with this skeleton bone. But the reason I'm going for this kind of off-white is I'm actually going to be darkening it down when we get to the wash stage, which we'll be doing next. Because of that, it means that I can get a little bit more of a darker tone than I'm actually painting with this base colour. And we'll talk about washes in a second, but first I'm just going to use this creamy sort of off-white colour to paint the paper that's hanging from their hip. Whenever you've got a little bit of detailing like this, you can see that there's sort of runes carved into this strip of paper. You want to make sure that, again, you're not putting too much paint in, because if you load it up with paint, then that paint is just going to fill all the recesses and you're going to lose all that beautiful detailing. Okay, so I've got my models for a sort of good place. I've got all the sort of base colours that I'm looking for. We've got the nice flat oranges against all of the main areas of fabric. We've got these little detail bits of fabric which are sort of coated in this kind of dark, cool grey. And we've also got the leather straps on the belt and a bit of paper hanging down nicely painted. Now I'm going to move on to washes. We might come back to base colours, we might do some extra painting on top, but this is generally the sort of second step of your paint job. Usually you want to get your base colours done first, and then you start washing. The washing can take a little time to dry, so you don't want to be doing it in between every single different colour that you're using, otherwise it'll take you flipping ages. So once you've done your base coat, then we'll move over to washes. So we spoke about them earlier, but a wash is essentially a very, very thin paint. Now I actually really like the Citadel ones. Again, they are quite expensive for what they are, but they tend to be the ones that work the best and what I really want them to do. They tend to flow a lot nicer and they've got loads of different colour options as well, which is always nice. And as you can see on that sort of detail camera, it is super thin. It is literally almost just coloured water. Now what we're going to be doing with this is we're actually going to be applying a coat pretty much over everything that we want it to shade, and that is just going to sit and pool in all of the recesses of the model. But the thing that you need to be really careful about is this is still a paint. So because this is a black wash, this Nuln oil that's from the Citadel range, this is a black colour, which means that if I apply it only over anything that's really bright and vibrant, especially if I applied it over like white, for example, it's going to pigment that white, it's going to darken it down, it's going to turn it into grey. If I applied it over my orange, it would have the same effect. It would make it really desaturated and grey and muddy. So I want to avoid any of those super bright areas because that's not what we're going to be after. Whereas things like the metallics, for example, or those dark greys and those browns and things are going to be perfect for a wash because it's going to add detail, and those colours are still going to look nice and strong underneath because they match those colours, especially the armour. So you might think that the metallics are quite bright, but because those metallics are such a strong colour and because they shine through, they're going to shine through that Nuln Oil really easily. And because this is, it's Nuln Oil for a reason, these dark black washes look really good on armour because it looks like they're almost sort of like slick with grease and oil, which is obviously what you want your armour to be when you're using it. So I'm going to start with this black wash. We're going to go over all the metallics, and I'm also going to go over the greys, but I'm going to leave the paper and the belts for now because I've got a different colour I want to use for those. Again, give it a little light shake. You don't want to shake it too hard because it is literally just water and it will start bubbling up. If you've got one of these Citadel bottles, one of these washes, these things spill with the slightest movement. It's almost like they have purposefully made these bottles as spillable as possible, so be super careful with them, otherwise you'll get paint all over your table. So we're just going to grab a nice sizable brush again. We want something with a decent tip because this is actually going to absorb the watery paint rather than just have a layer over the top of it. We're actually going to get it into the bristles like a sponge. We're going to grab as much as we want. We can grab this straight from the pot rather than putting it on a palette. You can put it on a palette as well. And with these Citadel paint pots, you can actually just sort of scrape the brush along the edge to get off any excess. And then we've got a nice even amount on our brush. I'm going to close this so I don't spill it because I always do. After grabbing our model, we can then start to apply this wash, and this is kind of the exact opposite of applying normal paint, because you can be as messy with this as you kind of want. So I'm going to start applying it over these shoulder pads here at the top. Now, as you can see, as I paint it over, rather than actually painting over a colour, it's instead just sort of lightly shading the base colours, and then all that really thin paint is just pooling in all of the little nooks and crannies of the model. And it's creating this sort of shadow effect. Now it's going to look a little bit wet on the camera because obviously it's being lit with a big bright light. But as that dries, it's going to become a bit more matte. You can get washes that specifically dry wet or wet look, so you can get like a nice shiny texture as well, which is great for armor. Things like gloss from the Citadel range. Like I said, as we apply that, it's just going to pick up all those details. It's going to apply this nice shadow over everything that we've already done and give it this lovely depth. Now you can already see how well it's affected those shoulder pads, but those are nice big flat areas. If we look at the head of this hammer here, you can see how much of that detail it immediately picks out. And honestly, we here at Dicebreaker call this stuff make look good water, because it is that magic. If you're just doing your first ever amateur paint job, you might even be tempted to just leave it after this wash because it looks so good. But trust me, we can make it look better, so stick around. Now if you ever apply too much wash to a point of your model, you can see that I've accidentally got a huge glob of paint here on the headpiece. You can actually just take some of that paint out of your bristle, make it a little bit more dry, then as you just sort of poke the paint, that brush will soak it up like a little sponge. So you can take away some of that paint and stop it from pooling too hard in any areas where it's sort of all come into one point. You want to make sure you do that because anywhere where it's too thick, it will dry super shiny and make it look a little bit fake. Which is not really what we're after. Now immediately you can see that that wash has brought so much more depth to all those metallics. What was just a flat sprayed colour has now got a lot more shading going on and looks a lot more interesting. Now this Nuln Oil doesn't really have a colour. It's just sort of thin black paint. But we can use coloured washes to get some really interesting effects. So for example, one wash again from the same Citadel line that's really popular is this Agrax Earthshade. It's this really dark brown wash, and it's great for doing anything like muddy, leathery, or even papery. So I'm going to use this Agrax Earthshade over that paper strip. I'm going to use it over the leather belt as well, and that is going to apply a sort of brown tint to it, but it's also going to do that pooling shadow effect that we got from the null null before, all in one go. You can see this paper right now is this sort of bright cream colour. It's quite pallid. It's barely got any detail to it. As we apply even just one coat of this brown wash, that's going to pick up all those details, especially the little runes on the paper, as well as giving a bit more prominence to those sort of embossed edges of the type and runes on the paper strip. It's also applying like a brown filter to the colour that we've already put down, making it a lot more like a sort of aged paper, like a scroll. I've got one last thing that I need to wash, and that is the orange. Now if I apply one of those null oils or Agrax Earth shades, that dark, really cloying colour is going to really ruin the bright, vibrant orange that I've got here. So I want to make sure to avoid it with those colours at all costs. Instead, what I'm going to use is more of a colourful wash, which is hopefully going to give it a little bit more detail without losing some of the bright orange that we've already got, which we've spent a long time building up with those multiple coats. Now, of course, you can get orange washes. I don't have one to hand, but I do have this Carabao Crimson, which is a nice red tone. So hopefully that should get some nice warm shadows to our bright, vibrant orange. I'm going to shake this back up, just grabbing some on my brush, making sure it's nice and even, not too heavy either. And that's when we can start applying it to this orange. You can see that it's giving us those shadows. We're not sacrificing too much of that colour. Now already that looks like a far more detailed model. Those washes have done a great job of picking up all of the little recesses in the model and making sure that they get a nice proper shadow to them. You can see here on the back where the cloth is, this orange is still looking nice and strong, but that red is just sitting in the crevices, the folds of the fabric, to make sure that we're getting a little bit more depth. Now I'm going to leave this to properly dry. I want to make sure there's no wet wash left on the model before we move on to the next few steps. Okay, so I've left my model for a little bit to dry, and you can see that as that shade is dried, it's become a lot more matte, which means a lot of that sort of shiny, glossy texture that we got from the wet paint has started to recede. There's a couple little areas where it's maybe pulled a little bit too much, but that is not the end of the world. Don't worry about it. We're going to start to bring some more of that colour back as well. So you can see, especially in the orange here, all washes pretty much will make bright colours a bit more dull. So we're going to use some highlighting to bring those back up and make those a little bit more poppy. So now we're going to start highlighting, and I've got a bit of a brighter orange here from Vallejo, and you can see if we compare those two, it's a much darker tone than this. So what I'm going to use this for is to just hit those raised edges. This is what's called edge highlighting. By doing that, I'm going to sort of accentuate the details of that cloak. Now, because this isn't the biggest model in the world, I'm actually going to bring my brush down a size and grab one of my smaller ones. As we get to those fine details, you tend to find that the smaller, finer brushes are obviously going to give you a bit more control. So whilst you shouldn't really be using them too much for any big flat planes of colour, for these tiny little details they become a little bit more handy. Now for edge highlighting, instead of just having loads of paint on the brush or hardly any, what we're actually more worried about is having a nice long coat of paint on the bristles. Whilst we should still be avoiding getting any paint near this metal end of the bristles, we want to have at least half of that brush sort of coated with paint that we can use. Again, we should be keeping it nice and thin. But the reason for that is we're actually going to use, instead of the tip of the brush, the sides of the bristles to just grab against these raised edges on our model. So as I show you here, using the long coat of paint here that I've got, I'm just going to run the side of my brush just against the raised edges. I'm barely going to touch it, and it's just going to get those highest peaks of the folds of fabric. You see, it's super subtle, but that has just given a bit of an edge to that raised edge. Whereas before they were just kind of sinking into each other, this one right here has got way more colour to it. We're going to do the same on some of the other edges of this fabric. You can see there very subtle. That's just giving a bit more of a raised edge to the peaks of our fabric, making it a little bit more deep and complex. Now on these softer edges you want to be careful, because they're going to pick up a bit more paint. So you have to have a bit more of a steady hand and make sure it comes out straight. You can also do this against the literal edges of the colour. I grab a bit of paint here on my brush, just do it against the bottom edge of this cloak to get a nice strong outline. Now I'm going to do that on pretty much all of the orange on this model. All the parts of that fabric is just poking out, like right here on the back shoulders. You can also double up on your edge highlights. I could grab a white, for example, start to mix that in with my orange and build an even brighter highlight that I can then apply on the ones I've already applied. By grabbing just a little bit of this white, popping it in the middle here, doing the same with my orange, mix this together to get a lighter version of what I've just used. A very, very pale orange. Just keep mixing that together until I get the desired colour I'm after, and then use that as my new highlight colour. By picking out the areas where the edges are really raised, like for example on this bit of fabric here, you can then get even more contrast between the original colour and this new highlight. You can see now those highlights really starting to stand out from the rest of the model. Now the thicker and brighter your edge highlights are, the more sort of cartoonish the look will be and the effect that you'll achieve is. We're looking for a more natural colour, a more natural gradient between those brights and darks, gradual building up from darks to lights. Whereas in this case you can see I've gone straight from dark to light and it's made it a lot more cartoony. As you get brighter with your edge highlights, you also want to be a little bit shorter with how much of the model they affect. So for example, if I grab a bit more white, keep mixing into this orange to basically about as bright as this orange can be, almost pure white. I don't want to apply that to the entirety of the edge highlight, just want to apply it to the most raised edges. Remember, the less paint you have on your brush, the more control you have. So especially with these edge highlights, don't get a huge dollop on, just get the smoothest, slightest bit of paint you can. It's going to make it a lot easier to apply those edge highlights. Now a much quicker but much less controlled version of this edge highlighting is something called dry brushing. And for that, you need to grab some of your kitchen roll, tear some off, nice and dry, make sure that you've got the clean version rather than the one that you've just been bristling for the entire paint job. Then you want to grab either a proper dry brush. You can again buy these from places like Games Workshop. Now, these ones have very, very dry bristles, which are very, very hard edged, and you'll see from this absolute state of my brush that this can be very destructive. So do not do this technique with a brush that you care about. Use it with one that is either purpose built for that or one that you don't really care about anymore, one that's a bit older and a bit more brittle. You can also use something like a makeup brush if you're looking for a much softer effect with this, but with this we've got a tiny little miniature and this is a huge brush. I'm going to put this one to the side for now. Now making sure that your bristles are nice and clean, you can do that by just rubbing them against a paper towel to make sure there's no paint coming off of a different colour than what you need. We're going to grab the colour of paint that I want. I'm just going to put it on the tips of the bristles here. So I'm just going to grab this light orange and I'll show you what we can do with it. Just got it so it's only on the tip of the brush. Next step is to grab our tissue paper and we're going to work our bristles straight into that tissue paper and try and get as much of that paint worked into the bristles and off of our brush so there's no wet paint left sitting there. You can also just fan it across your hand. You should literally get it to a point when almost it looks like nothing is coming off. Once you've done that, grab your model and you're going to start flicking the brush back and forth in the opposite direction, so against the grain of the edges on your model. So in this case, edge of that fabric is going up and down, so I'm going left and right instead. Dry brushing is just going to pick up all of those most sharp and raised edges of the model, and it's going to grab them and not paint the sort of more recessed, harder to reach areas, which means you're going to get a natural highlight by doing so. Now we've already been edge highlighting this, so it's going to be a little bit more difficult to tell where that dry brushing has hit. You can start to see this fabric, it's got way more going on now than it did in the first place. Way more highlights, way more depth of all of that washing and edge highlighting, giving us a much more complete looking model. Speaking of complete, whilst this isn't the most complicated paint job I've ever done, this is definitely looking a lot more like a table ready miniature that you can put as part of your army or your RPG, whatever it is that you're doing with these miniatures. Now the last step for any model is to base it, and that is where we take the actual base of the model, this plastic disc that it is placed upon, and we give it a little bit more colour, life and texture and definition to make it look like a complete finished miniature. Now this one, you can see that I've actually rotated the model quite a lot, so there's plenty of space here on the base for us to show off what that looks like and how we get it looking as good as possible. So the first step is to grab a paintbrush and we are going to base coat this base. Now it might seem silly because we're going to be covering this and stuff, but you do want to have a nice earthy neutral tone underneath all of your grass and stones and bits that I'll be showing you in a minute, because otherwise you'll have whatever color it is that is underneath that, whether that is just matte black or in this case shiny metallic, shining through as if the earth was made out of brass, which is not really what we want, not the intended effect at all. So I'm going to grab one of my larger brushes. I'm going to grab a nice, for my purposes, dark grey. For this one, honestly, you can get a nice big glob of paint. It's not the end of the world. You're literally just applying a colour underneath to make sure that it is based. Now the colour of this stone isn't far off the brass, but it's going to leave some of that metallic shimmer behind, which is definitely not what we want from our floor pattern. I'm actually going to grab some dark grey and make this even darker underneath, because I've got some really dark basing materials, so I want to make sure that it blends in with this grey that we've already got on there. Makes it a little bit darker. Now for this final step, there's a few more materials that you're going to need. This is going to be the piece of resistance for your lovely model. You're going to grab an old brush that you do not care about, or even one of those plastic spatulas, because you are going to be using PVA glue. This stuff is just from Hobbycraft. It's nice, it's standard, it's drying clear, which is very important. You don't want anything that dries of a certain colour. Make sure you just get clear, drying glue. If you get the white stuff, then obviously everything will turn white as it dries, which isn't going to look amazing unless you're trying to do some kind of effect like ice or anything like that. So this is just clear glue, just PVA, non-toxic, standard stuff. Shouldn't cost very much money. I've got a crappy brush that I'm going to use to apply it to my base. Once I've done that, we're going to use our basing material. So this you can buy from pretty much any modelling shop or hobby shop. This is a brand called Warlord Games, which I've gotten these from, and this is basing material. So if we open this up, you can see that this is essentially tiny little blades of fake grass. Now I've got like a really dark sort of scorched earth kind of terrain here. You can see that as I sort of mess it around, it looks a lot like just sort of tiny little blades of grass which are going to be sticking to the glue on the base of our model. For a bit of texture, I've also got some tiny little stones. This is called medium red basing material, and this is more of a sort of pebble beach almost, tiny little shards of stone which we're going to be using to break up the sand and grass, etc. that we use on our model. Now I'm literally just going to be using these two. And the first step is to give our little glue a shake. We're going to put a tiny dollop on the base of our model. We'll actually drip some on the table there, which isn't great. Just be careful because this stuff can go everywhere. Close that up so it doesn't spill. I'm going to get rid of my spill. Make sure that we don't have big globs of glue drying all over the table, which is not what we want. And then using my crappy old brush, I'm going to move that glue around to give it a nice even coating around all of this base. Grab any excess as well, move it to a different part of the base. Got a little bit of space here at the front. This is going to dry relatively quickly, so make sure you do this nice and quickly. I recommend getting more of your paper towels and laying some down because this stuff is messy. It will get everywhere. You might even want to get, again, one of those little takeaway boxes you can put underneath yourself because you can reuse anything that you spill. So placing our mini on our paper towels like this, I'm going to grab, I'm first going to do this grass. I'm going to pop that down, I'm going to hold our miniature over it and just pick it up in little clumps and just start to almost drizzle it, you know, like a herb and spice over your cooking, over that glue, just pressing it down every now and again, creating a nice grassy texture for our models to stand on top of. I want to make sure there's no wet paint on your model because this glue, grassy stuff, will stick to it. And you won't be able to get rid of it. So get a nice generous coating. And then to get rid of the excess, we're just going to tap it over the rest of the grass. And all that stuff that we didn't actually need, all that stuff that's superfluous, is just going to fall back in. And as that dries, we've gone from a flat, boring base into a miniature that is standing on pretty grass. Now once that dries, we can grab our glue again, get a little glob just on our brush, apply that to a little patch somewhere, perhaps here on the edge. Some of that grass might come back up, but that's okay. We can grab our little stones, start putting them on as well. Now at this point it's very useful to have some tweezers because it'll make it a lot easier to get these stones on. I'm not sure I've brought mine in unfortunately, so I'm just going to be applying them by hand. But we're just going to press those into the glue. They're just going to stick down. If you want a sort of shiny rain slick effect, you can actually put a tiny bit more glue on top of those stones. Not only will they hold better, but they will dry shiny. Which is great for a sort of riverbed or anything of that ilk. Just be careful as you're putting your glue on because that will stick to the rocks and then the rocks will stick to your brush. As you can see, we can just apply those little stones to this base. I'm going to do a little bit more over here on the side. Grab a glob of glue again. Spread it over this part of the base. Grab some of my smaller stones. Just start to work those into the glue. And now that is looking much more like an actual base for your miniature. A little bit of texture, a bit of detail, gives it that nice finishing touch to make it look like a finished piece of art. All that's left is to get some black paint, if you wish. Just paint around the rim of that little disc that your miniature is standing on. It'll just add like a nice frame effect. With that, your miniature is finished. And that's how we take you all the way from this plastic sprue to this beautiful little painted miniature. Please do send us a picture. We are over on Twitter at JoinDicebreaker. Send us a pic. Let us know how your miniatures came out. I'm pretty proud of this nice little orange one. This is for a quick paint job. Considering I've been teaching you all along the way, it's come out pretty well, I think. But let me know what you think about it in the comments below. Please do leave us a like, give us a comment, anything that helps us to get in front of more people. We really appreciate it when you share our videos across the internet as well. Click subscribe and hit the bell icon to get notified whenever we put a new video live. And also you can hit join if you want to subscribe to the channel's membership program to get exclusive videos and loads of goodies on top of that as well. We are also full of fantastic articles over on dicebreaker.com. Go on over to our website where we've got all sorts of things, whether it's miniature painting, trading card games, anything, you name it, and we've probably got an article on it. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you in the next video. I hope that this has helped and I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. Please show me what you've been working on, but until then, have a lovely day. Goodbye.